All right, we're recording. Here is my audience for the persuasive speech. Miss Angie's going to be the camera operator, so I'm going to let her get up and get in place. But thank you guys for coming and listening to the speech this morning. All right, Angie, you can come and operate this thing, and we will be in business. You can make sure it looks right and get it adjusted, and I'll let you hold the opening credits, and we'll get started here in a second. 8 minutes. And we're
Shoot.
Does it look all right? I tell you what, it might need more or less light. Yeah, it's hard to
It
tell.
was good a minute ago, now it's too bright. It was okay.
Well, I must have hit something here. What did I do? Well, I messed up the timer somehow, too. I had that problem earlier.
Oh, no.
See, now it's
No,
something
sorry.
different. I don't know what it is.
Bye, guys.
Okay. All right, very good. Here's the end part. And whenever you're ready and focused, just say, start in 10 seconds. Start in 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and then hit the start button going 4, 3, 2, 1. Hit the timer and we'll get started. Very good. Thank you for coming to today's edition of The End, where we put an end to your medical questions. Last week we looked at your financial health. This week we're going to look at your spiritual health, because both of them are important for your overall well-being. It's Easter time, and people around the world will be reading the New Testaments and looking at the story of Jesus. They're going to be asking this question: how do I know that the stories I read in my New Testament are similar to the story as it was written 2,000 years ago? In other words, we've got a problem. The problem is, can we know with accuracy that the New Testament we read today is very similar to the one that was written 2,000 years ago? I think that we can answer that question with a solid yes, and I'm going to show you why. I'm going to offer you the problem and show you the solution here in the next few minutes. But we need to start with some misconceptions about the New Testament. Some people think that the New Testament was put together in a linear fashion. And by that I mean similar to the game of telephone. You played that game telephone in school, where one student said something to another, another passed it on to the next one, and by the time the sentence got to the end of the class, it was completely, wildly different from the original sentence. There was no comparison at all. But the good news is the New Testament is not put together in a linear fashion, but in a geometric fashion and in a community, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. The second misconception about the New Testament is that it was put together in an oral tradition, and it was not. The New Testament was handed down in a written tradition, which is much more concrete and easier to use. If you go to the website str.org, Stand to Reason, you'll find an article asking this question: is the New Testament authentic? And in that article, it will talk about textual criticism, and that's what I'm going to give you an example of today. This is a very simple example of how they take ancient texts and verify their authenticity. Let's say you've got Aunt Sally. She makes an elixir, and it's a potion for the family youth. Well, Aunt Sally's getting younger every day. She's drinking that elixir, and she decides, you know, I better write this down, my original recipe, and so she writes it down. She's friends with 3 ladies in the Bridge Club, so she writes an original copy of that for the ladies in the Bridge Club as well. So now you've got 4 original copies in existence. The ladies in the Bridge Club make 10 copies each, and so now you've got 30 copies of copies. Well, one day Aunt Sally gets up, and lo and behold, her pet Schnauzer has eaten her original copy, and it's gone. She calls her friends in the Bridge Club. Mysteriously, all of their original copies are gone too. The question that textual criticism asks is this: can Aunt Sally reproduce her original recipe from these copies of copies? And of course the answer is yes, and I'll show you how they do it. Aunt Sally and her friends go and gather up all of these copies of the New Testament, or the elixir, that they can find. Let's say they can only find 27 of them. They can't get them all. And they spread them out on the kitchen table, and they find out that there are some problems. One of the copies has an extra ingredient. 2 of the copies have the order wrong for how you mix the ingredients up, and a 4th copy has some spelling errors. So what can Aunt Sally do? Well, because this elixir was put together in a community with her friends, they can all sit down and look at these copies and realize that, hey, this extra ingredient only shows up one time. We never put that extra ingredient in there. They can look at this order and realize that, hey, somebody just switched the order on 2 of the copies. That's easy to fix. And finally, the misspelling words are just that. They're just misspelled. And so they've got 23 copies that are in complete agreement, and they can easily understand how those errors crept into those 4 copies. It doesn't prevent them from recreating the original. Now, F.F. Bruce, the New Testament scholar, in his book New Testament Documents, said that the objective for textual criticism is to take what's available and come up with as accurate a copy as possible. And this is true not only for religious documents, but for any document in antiquity. So I think it's important for us to see how the New Testament compares to other documents of the time. Josephus was a 1st century historian. We have 9 copies of Josephus' work, and the youngest one is 400 years from the events that Josephus is talking about. So it's 400 years removed from the events of that Jewish history in the 1st century. Tacitus, the Roman historian, also wrote in the 1st century, and that's when Jesus was on the earth. We only have 2 copies of his works, and they're just partial copies, and they're 1,000 years removed from the events that Tacitus writes about. So how does this compare with the New Testament? We'll see that in just a minute. Thucydides, we only have 8 copies of his work. Caesar's Gallic Wars, 10. Herodotus, 8. Plato, 7. They're all 1,000 years removed from the events that they talk about. Homer's Iliad, which you've probably read in high school, we have 647 copies of that. But my point is, all of these ancient historical documents are between 400 and 1,500 years removed from the events that they describe. But when we read Roman and Greek history, we still consider it accurate because that's normal for ancient historical documents to have that time gap. So let's compare the New Testament, a document from that same time period. There's over 5,000 copies of the New Testament. Some of the fragments go as close to 50 years within the events in the life of Jesus. Some of them are as old as 400 years removed, but that's within the normal time frame for that part of antiquity. Now, not all of these 5,000 copies are complete. Only about 50 of them are complete New Testaments. Many of them are fragments, or some of them are just partial New Testaments. But you can see that we have many, many copies that we can go do work on. The ancient church history is also important. Bruce Metzger, the scholar from Yale, said that even if all the copies of the New Testament were missing, the history books of the church would make up almost the entire New Testament. There were historians that were writing down things about the life of Jesus. Those historians never intended for that stuff to get in the Bible, but it's accurate history of what happened in the early church. So let's compare quickly the New Testament and other documents from that time frame. The New Testament, 50 to 400 years from the event that they were writing about. Other historical documents, 400 to 1,500 years. So the New Testament is clearly within an accurate time frame or a legitimate time frame. The number of copies, we have 50 complete copies of the New Testament from antiquity and 5,000 plus copies, partial copies of the New Testament. So in terms of numbers, the New Testament is clearly within range of any other historical document. Some of those, as you remember, only had 2, 8, 10, 647. So the evidence is clear that the New Testament has the substantial numbers for us to look at it accurately from a scientific and a textual critic's point of view. The differences in the New Testament, out of 20,000 lines, only 40 lines are in doubt. That's about 400 words. Scholars say, Christian and non-Christian, that the New Testament is 99.5% accurate as it was related to its original writings 2,000 years ago. Now that's a lot of information for you to absorb. And my purpose was not to convince you because I had to go quickly since we only had 7 or 8 minutes. My purpose is this. I hope that you'll take some time to look at these 5 resources and you make the decision for yourself. Josh McDowell, a book called The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict is a good beginning place. Lee Strobel, my personal favorite, The Case for Christ. You can also go to str.org. You can Google F.F. Bruce or the scholar from Yale, Bruce Metzger. You go to any of those 5 sources and you're going to find a bunch of evidence. Thank you for looking at this comparison of the New Testament. Hope you have a great Easter season. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right, right?